So welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada podcast. And today's really special because normally I'm talking to somebody who is on the end of a Zoom call. And today I've got Martin Shain in the flesh with me. So that's exciting. And Martin and I go way back. So this will be like a trip down memory lane. But hopefully everybody will enjoy that along with us enjoying ourselves. So, Martin, do you want to start with introducing yourself?
Yes, certainly, Marianne. First of all, thanks very much for having me. This is a real pleasure to be doing this live with you like this. It's an unexpected pleasure. Yes, so I'm Martin Shain. I am an academic lawyer. I think that's probably the closest thing to reality that I can say. I was a social scientist for the majority of my career, but then I went back to the law to do a doctorate which I finished in 1990. And that was a turning point in my career because the sort of things that I'd been looking at before, having to do with health in the workplace and such, then took on a different kind of context, which was a legal context. And so my career has been sort of social science up to a certain point, and then law beyond that, and then a combination of that that leads me to my current work, which is, as you know, is on psychological health and safety in the workplace.
Yeah, and so talking about psychological health and safety, I think the first time I heard the term came from you. So what I want to know is, when was the first time you heard the term?
I think I first heard about it. It's an interesting question, actually, and I'm not entirely sure what the deepest origins of the term are, but I first came across it in a book about workers' compensation in California in 1976. And it was being used in the context of workers' compensation. So that's the first I heard of it. Then the term shows up in American literature, research literature, where psychological safety it really is used to refer to, is it safe to speak up in the workplace? So, for example, if a nurse notices a surgeon leaving an instrument in somebody's stomach while they've been operating, how safe is it for her to say something about that?
And we want it to be very safe for her to say
We do. That's absolutely right. And so a lot of the American research had to do on psychological safety, as it was then called. Had to do with how do you create a workplace in which it is safe to speak up. But, we have taken that term and expanded its meaning quite considerably, so that the psychological safety that is envisioned by, say, the national standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace is a much broader concept. It still contains that earlier concept of safety to speak up, but it has a lot more other dimensions with it as well.
Yeah, quite a bit more.
Yeah.
So let's go back, because when I first met you, you were working on Neighbour at work. Can you talk a bit about what that was?
Neighbour at work. Yes. Well, Neighbour at work is a sort of a pet subject of mine. And I hate to reveal my age to this extent, but I've been carrying the idea with me really since I was at law school at Oxford in 1963. So this is an old idea. Let me see if I can make a succinct story out of this. Basically, the legal concept of the neighbor is anybody that you can reasonably foresee will be affected by your words and deeds. That's the legal idea of it. So basically the neighbor at work was as an extension of that idea, to the point where we're saying the neighbor at work is somebody who takes every reasonable effort to foresee how their words and deeds will affect their co-workers. I mean, it's basically just a transposing a social standard into the workplace. Easier said than done, but that's basically what I was trying to do, thinking that that if we can get to the prevention of reasonably foreseeable harm, we will have crossed a threshold into the prevention of all sorts of bad things that happen in the workplace: discrimination, harassment, bullying, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it won't eliminate it, but it will, if we can elevate the need, a requirement to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm to the masthead of a cultural standard in the workplace, then in fact we probably would be able to relate all these other specific programs and policies having to do with harassment, discrimination, bullying, and so forth, to that general principle, which would see, we spend so much time talking about, maybe I'm finally getting to the point here. We spend so much time talking about what we shouldn't do in the workplace. You know, we shouldn't discriminate, we shouldn't harass, we shouldn't bully, but there's less attention paid to the proactive aspects, which is what the neighbor at work idea does. And the neighbor at work is a personification of a person who would take every reasonable effort to prevent harm to their co-workers. And to do that, we require three imperatives or principles, which are the neighbor at work imperatives. Those are awareness, understanding, and carefulness. And simple though they sound, those are the three driving ideas behind the neighbor at work concept. And that can be articulated into policies and programs and all sorts of stuff that you can do in the workplace. Beyond that, I would like to see the idea incorporated into a more regulatory framework as well. And I don't mean by that making it into a, you can't legislate culture, but you can create some baselines and foundations that you can build upon to create a more psychologically safe workplace.
So we'll get into the regulation, because I know that's always been something that you've thought about, and I really want to explore it. But I want you to break down awareness, understanding, and carefulness for us and what that actually means, because the irony is that a lot of leaders are worried about psychological health and safety, or safe voice, because they think that means people can say whatever they want whenever they want, and it will be chaos. So talk about, how do we help build awareness, understanding, and carefulness among all employees?
Well, I think first of all, we have to articulate what we mean by awareness, understanding, and carefulness. Awareness means, if you translate that into an imperative, it means try to be more aware of how your words and deeds affect other people. And first of all, you've got to identify who those people are. So one of the activities that can be done around that, as part of introducing the neighbor at work concept, is an exercise that I call circles of influence. So you basically, it's a sociogram. You basically identify the kind of people you write down on a piece of paper, assisted by whatever diagrams you can provide, that ask you to identify who you think you influence and who influences you on a day-to-day basis. So you have little circles around yourself in the middle, and that is the first step toward awareness, because I think a lot of people aren't even thinking about how they affect, who they affect. And I mean, just sometimes passing somebody in the hall every day can have an influence. It's cumulative, and it's not, no one thing in itself is going to necessarily make or break your day.
Right. But if I never look you in the eye, if I never acknowledge your existence and I see you on a regular basis, it's going to have an impact, what we do and what we don't do.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so if we can cross that threshold of awareness, then the next thing is that, well, how much do we understand and recognize and acknowledge about the needs, interests, and rights of the people that we've identified as being in our circle or sphere of influence? And that of course is a a more difficult undertaking to achieve. But you know, again, there are exercises that can be developed or have been developed to begin to get people to address other people's needs. And on the basis of building awareness and understanding, the culmination of this is carefulness, the third principle. And carefulness simply means, on the basis of your awareness and understanding, try then to avoid doing reasonably foreseeable harm to those people. Because now you're armed with knowing a lot more about people. You should be able to foresee what's going to hurt them or help them, actually, for that matter. But the basic principle is do no harm. So, you know, we're starting this from the premise that we want to avoid harm before moving on to anything more proactive or positive.
Yeah. So it takes time to help employees who are at various levels of emotional intelligence and awareness to develop that. Like your concept of understanding, I would call empathy, right? Being able to put myself in somebody else's shoes and to think that just because I didn't invite you for lunch, like, what do you care?
Yeah.
But then I can think, well, what might they feel like? They might feel excluded. They might feel like they're not part of the team, or yeah. So that's great that the whole Neighbor at Work has definitely held up from the decades that you've been doing it. Like, it's still very valid and a straightforward way to start to build psychological safety.
I think it is. I over the years, I've gained and lost confidence in its traction. And oddly, perhaps not so oddly, but in the last couple of years with the pandemic, it seems that it has attracted more attention than before. Especially, I think now people are going back into the workplace, physically going back into the workplace. It seems to be raising the question of, you know, what do we owe one another? And I put that in the context of what do we owe one another as neighbors at work. I mean, so it's a very fundamental question to ask about any culture, is what do we owe one another? And I mean, that applies really in a domestic situation as well as in a workplace situation. It's quite a universal idea to my mind, but it's not one that we're accustomed to thinking about in the workplace.
So you said that sometimes your confidence in that approach wavered. Why would it waver?
Well, I think because to put it bluntly, it has seemed too flaky sometimes.
Yeah, that they want something harder driving. Let's talk about mental illness. Let's talk about performance. The idea of Neighbor at Work is too airy-fairy for some leaders, right? But you know, this is a lot of my work right now is about languaging in the way that you can be heard.
Yeah.
And so I think your concepts, let's build awareness of our influence. Let's deepen our understanding of the impact that we could have, and let's then decide what is going to be acceptable and not acceptable. We can language it in a way that's much more hard hitting, but it doesn't mean that the concepts waver.
No.
Just that the openness to having a neighbor at work, might waver. So
yeah. I mean, initially when people hear about the idea, they tend to be quite enthusiastic, but then they go back into the workplace. Say you're doing it and you're introducing the idea in a workshop context or something like that, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about it, and then people go back into the workplace and they realize how difficult it actually is to do it on a day-to-day basis. Which is why the idea really needs to be carried, I think, by senior leadership. It needs to be carried by everybody, but it needs to be carried by senior leadership as a sort of a driving cultural imperative.
Right.
Like, this is how we do. This is how we relate to one another, as a sort of superordinate kind of principle of care in the workplace. And everything else is sort of, in a sense, flows from that. Well, why do we have, workshops on respectful workplace or harassment or discrimination or any of that stuff, bullying? It all derives from these cardinal duties we owe one another as neighbors at work in the workplace. So I think the added value comes from leadership recognizing that this is an important driving concept that actually animates all the other bits and pieces of stuff that we've got under human resources, occupational health and safety, and so forth. And they're all sort of brought together under this general driver of the neighbor at work.
Well, because it's really, we're adults and we should be able to decide what kind of a work environment we want, and we should be able to contribute to it ourselves. And going through those three principles and deciding, this is how we're going to interact with each other. This is how we will intervene if we're not. It just, to me, makes so much sense. Why do we have to be victims in a workplace? Instead, we can choose as adults that, no, we're going to have this kind of environment. This is what we want. So I know that part of your reasoning for wanting regulation is related to the people who see psychological health and safety as a nice to do. So let's talk a little bit about, if Dr. Martin Shain was in charge of the world, what would be regulated? How would that look?
Well, first of all, may I say a couple of more things about why we need regulation? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Because I think that regulation for its own sake doesn't make any sense. I think where we are at with psychological safety is that we've managed, through the efforts of many people over many years, to get to a threshold where we have a voluntary standard, national standard. Wonderful thing. I mean, terribly proud to have been associated with that, with you and all the other, all the other actors. There aren't that many, but the people that have been associated with it. And it's great to have this voluntary national standard, but it's been out since 2013. And although, I mean, the uptake's been incredible in a lot of ways. But when you do, a closer look at how it's gone down, one of the things I see from my perspective on helping organizations to implement it, or helping organizations to help other organizations to implement it, is that it's reversible. So, one CEO can be incredibly enthusiastic, bring it on, let's do it. And 2 years later, he or she's gone. And it's like, well, what was that? That never happened. It was, and it's back to business as usual. So I'm looking for a way to avoid that. And the other part of that, the other problem is that right now, as a voluntary requirement, and we'll talk about what would be required in just a minute, but as a voluntary requirement, it comes over more as a privilege than as a right. So I think, to my mind, from my perspective, people do have a right to a psychologically safe workplace in the same way they have a right to a physically safe workplace. So what we've done great work by bringing psychological safety as a way of protecting mental health into the same framework as protecting physical safety, and we put both in an occupational health and safety framework. That was big. I mean, to get the national standard into an occupational health and safety framework, huge achievement. But we're not quite there yet, to my mind, because what psychological safety is like the poor cousin of physical safety right now, in that so far as it has to beg at the table for a seat. And that seat, once gained, can be lost and it can be put aside. So what I would like to see is a more regulatory approach to that, which would mean that you can't just do that. You can't just put it aside any more than you can put aside hard hats or safety fences or rules for working in enclosed spaces, because it will be locked in. Doesn't mean it's going to transform the world overnight, but it means that there's a greater incentive. And also it means that the directing minds of organizations have to take it more seriously, because it will be part of their accountability structure. I mean, it is even as a voluntary structure, it is, but at the same time, it's still optional. And I don't want it to be optional, to cut a long story short. I mean, I think that now, what parts of it can we regulate? I mean, can't regulate the whole thing, probably.
No, because some of it's aspirational and some of it,
yes.
But let's talk about that. What parts? Because that was one of the things that people said is, well, if you regulate it, you got to dumb it down, right? Because it's got to apply to every workplace, no matter what sector, no matter how large. And so how do you do that? But what are the pieces that you'd pull out and say, this is what needs to be regulated?
Well, I think that the key piece that I see as being lend itself to regulation is the assessment of risk part. You say, well, what's the good of doing an assessment of risk if you don't act upon it? I'm trying to be realistic about this and thinking, well, how far can you go given social readiness for this stuff? And I think the path has actually been carved out a bit by the federal government's regulations, which do include a requirement to assess risks. And that happened in no small part as a result of the conversations that were going on more generally, including within the standard, about the need to assess risks. And the feds have just taken it one step further and said, yes, we have to. We're going to do that through regulation. Now, the assessment of risks is, what are you trying to assess? You're trying to assess the riskiness of certain workplace environments, psychosocial workplace environments. And Guarding Minds at Work was originally designed to do that. And that was the function of Guarding Minds at Work, which is why it's so heavily referenced within the standard itself. It's not the only way to go.
Let's go. We'll come back to this, but because you brought up Guarding Minds, I still remember at the time I was with the Canadian Mental Health Association, and you started to talk to me about the law and how it already applied to hold employers responsible to do no harm in many different ways. Yeah. And I remember getting so excited because we had thought about doing an assessment for psychological health and safety. We didn't think about having the component to make sure that it included those things that you're going to be held responsible for as an employer anyways. You just won't probably know much about it till you get the lawsuit.
That's right.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
your thing was, well, what if we could do it so that it brought it to their awareness and we reduced risk? So can you tell a little bit more? Because Guarding Minds at Work as well was your title. You came up with that name, and we went from there. So tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, first of all, I think Guarding Minds at Work wouldn't have happened without you. So I want that to be on record.
Well, I don't know about that without me, but without the support of Canada Life and Workplace Strategies.
Well, yeah, but you brought that to bear. I mean, had you not done that, I don't know where we would be, because that was a turning point. I think that the need to assess risks came out actually in my own work. It had an origin with my work with Health Canada and the workplace health system, which was while we were still in the health promotion sort of way of thinking about what's workplace health and safety about. So that was sort of by about 1990, I guess, we had begun to include stuff in surveys of health risks in the workplace that included the impact of stress. And that was sort of like the foothold into a whole other world, because as the results came back from the workplace health system surveys, which we did in many, many workplaces across the country, it was apparent that the measures of stress that we had introduced, which ended up being called the stress satisfaction offset score, which is still being used today, was correlated with numerous health outcomes, everything from cardiovascular disease to digestive problems, including, very importantly, mental health outcomes. So the correlations were incredibly high. Now, it's not necessarily pointing to a causal relationship, but it's certainly pointing to a relationship that needs to be looked at more carefully. So it raised the question, well, to what extent are people's health issues in the workplace related, especially mental health issues, because that's our present context. To what extent are those issues related to the way the amount of stress in people's lives, in their work lives, but more particularly how stress and satisfaction is regulated in the workplace? And this had to do, it takes you straight back to the doorstep of the way work's organized and people are managed, basically.
But that was revolutionary, because before, if you had a nervous breakdown or a heart attack or depression, that was because you were weak.
Yeah.
Now you're suggesting that me, the employer, is responsible for some of that? Some
of that, yeah, yeah. And of course, the pushback was, where's personal responsibility and where's corporate responsibility? And it's a fine line, but as you suggest, I mean, it hadn't even been talked about before. So this happens at a crucial moment in the development of thinking about workplace health and safety, where the health promotion concept is shifting from the individual to the organization, and that. I don't know when that really first took place in any kind of broadly social context. I would say probably in mid-80s. And then by the late 1990s, it had sort of gained a foothold, I think. But it still hadn't translated into, well, what do we do about that? So what we do about that is having recognized that this is playing such a cardinal role, then we should have some way of assessing and addressing those risks in the workplace that employers can easily understand and get a handle on and do something about those risks. So that's really the origin. That's the sort of the thought origins of Guarding Minds at Work, is that we need this type of assessment, and on the basis of that assessment, we need we need to do we need to address the risks that have been identified.
Right, to try to manage them just like we would with any other risk,
Yeah.
right? Try to mitigate or eliminate them.
That's right.
So you create guarding minds at work, and then the conversation, and of course the way I tell it is a doctor, a lawyer, and a social worker walk into a bar, because it's true. We did walk into a bar. We were having beer. We did talk about it.
Yeah.
But tell me how you talk about the first ideas that let's take, because we have a tool now that's free. How did it go from that to why don't we create a standard?
I've been thinking about that actually, because it's almost lost in the mist of time. So the opportunity arose somewhere between 2007, 2008 to take a look at the stresses in the workplace through a legal lens. And that was work that was commissioned by the Mental Health Commission of Canada. And it's Bill Wilkerson was instrumental in getting that study commissioned. And the study turned out to be a 150-page tome called Stress, Mental Injury and the Law in Canada. And it was an opportunity first to identify, you spoke about all the legal bits and pieces that sort of conspire to suggest that there's already a duty of care to prevent certain types of harm in the workplace. But this paper was an opportunity to identify what's later became like a super duty of care to provide a psychologically safe workplace. Like it was proposed in that paper for the first time that there is this underlying duty of care below all these other bits and pieces of legal rules and regulations in tort, contract, occupational health and safety, workers' compensation, and so forth. A general idea that, well, if we just pull back a little bit and looked at what's the basis for all this, well, it's to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm to mental health in this case. So that's basically suggested that, well, if that is the case, then do we not need some sort of a standard to reflect this duty of care? Because we don't have anything like that in the workplace at the moment.
No, it's just all these little bits and pieces everywhere that, as I said before, employers weren't always aware of until they had a problem. No,
exactly. And I think it's easy to miss the wood for the trees with this history, because it happened really very fast in a lot of ways. But all those bits and pieces that you mentioned, a lot of them were typically embedded in HR. So what does that do? Well, it basically, HR it's not occupational health and safety. So what the 2008 paper did was basically say that this ought to be an occupational health and safety standard. If it's going to be a standard at all, that's where it belongs, because there is a duty to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm. That's not something that you can articulate within an HR framework very easily. You can translate it into HR, but you can't. The headwaters of that should be in occupational health and safety. So that's where the idea for a prototype for the national standard, a standard, came up, and that the prototype for that was included in that 2008 paper. And then through a process that I still barely understand, in which you were again the central figure, it's all very well for me to say there needs to be a standard. But there's a long road between saying that and knowing how to make that happen. And you knew how to make it happen. I didn't. So
well, we learned as we went. That book, The Evolution of Workplace Mental Health in Canada, that's exactly what that book was. I thought, because like you, I'm thinking we might forget how this even happened.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
it really
yeah.
was so fast moving and so many people. So it's nice that you credit me, but you know, there were so many of us. When I say so many, dozens, not hundreds,
Yeah, yeah.
but that were working together
Mm,
to make it happen. And so, yeah, I'm glad we captured it
mm,
for posterity. And when the standard is updated, probably next year in
mm.
2023, when it's 10 years old, God, that seems really
I
quick
know.
too.
Mm.
But then I hope to open up the book and do another chapter and
Mm,
talk about
mm.
the evolution further after the standard
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah, you know, it's the evolution part of it is quite incredible, really, in a lot of ways, because I don't mean to digress here, but I mean, my career with the workplace started in the late 1970s, studying employee assistance programs. And, you know, looking back on that, that was sort of, we're studying end of the pipe type outcomes of the workplace. You know, how do you fix people that have already been harmed? Now, nearly half a century later, actually, we're at a point where we're saying, well, let's look at what's causing the harm in the first place. You know, so it's great to fish people out of the river and rescue them, but how about not throwing them in the first place?
Yeah.
So, you know, it doesn't feel like that long, but it has been long, I guess. But even so, it's been a kind of a transformational paradigm shift in terms of how we think about the workplace and the role of the workplace in society and its obligations to society, not to harm people. I mean, you know, the workplace is a source of social capital. It shouldn't be a source of social exhaust and you know damaging society. So, but of course, that's a story that's you know multiplied over many different issues, like you know environmental pollution, for example. I mean, it's in a sense it's parallel to that, but yeah, we've come a long way, and I'm very glad that you commissioned that study on the evolution, because it was very timely, and it will be great to have another chapter to that.
When you and I can't remember anything and somebody says, we'll just pull a book out and go, yeah, well, whatever, we don't remember, but here it is.
I'm ahead of you on the forgetting stuff.
So I want to go back, because you were talking about regulation and I was asking you about what, so you said assessment, but I'm pretty sure that assessment in and of itself would not be sufficient, because we could do these surveys every year and leave it at that. What else would you say should be regulated?
Well, I think the prototype standard that I had worked on in 2008 suggested that the assessment needs to lead to a plan, and there has to be a plan. Now, the plan is something that actually could be is parallel to the kind of plans that people organizations are supposed to have around things like harassment policy. And for example, the law in Ontario now says you have to have a harassment policy. Well, on the basis of this more general assessment of risk that we've been talking about, you need to have a plan. And the plan is basically an actionable thing, so that technically an inspector could look at that and say, well, where's your plan? Now, again, it still doesn't get you to the point where you say, as I think you're implying, you know, well, what's going to make people do it? But the fact of having a plan in existence, I think it creates a small p political pressure to do something about it. I mean, once people know there's this set of risks, because the way the assessment is done is it's highly participated. So it's not like management does it in the dark and doesn't tell anybody about it. People have to be involved in the way it's done and in the identification of these risks. So it's going to be a very come up with an assessment of risks and a plan to address those risks that can just simply be ignored, although it has happened.
Well, and I'm thinking, that if the assessment and the plan so the results of the assessment and the plan had to be shared with all employees, then the employees will hold you responsible. So it will happen that way. But there will be big pushback from organizations who don't want, what one person said to me is, we don't want the tail wagging the dog. And yet maybe it is that. Do you remember with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act? That used to be the way it was, is every year you had to have a plan for accessibility and you had to publish it and you had to show that you implemented it. But the problem there was they just couldn't finance the auditors to go and make sure it was being done. And so it became, I think, something that's much lighter now, where you're supposed to do it, but nobody's really checking.
Yeah, I think, again, though, it's a foothold, it's a start.
Yeah.
And if we don't start somewhere, we won't get where we want to go. Right now, the assessment of risks is entirely voluntary, except in the federal government sector. If I think the simple doing of if it's done properly, and as you say, if it's highly participative, which it's supposed to be, and in the standard, we talk about that as a cardinal principle of participation of
meaningful participation.
Yeah. And that's something that's easily ducked. People will pay lip service to participation. That's the history of labor relations, right? It's what do you really mean by participation? What is authentic participation? But again, there are certain criteria that you can hold up to that and say, well, if this and this are happening, then you have genuine participation. And the participation is in itself health promoting. So you're already doing some of the remedial work as you prepare these assessments.
Explain that more, how the participation itself is health promoting.
Well, I think because when people have voice, which, as we were saying earlier, is the original idea behind psychological safety, they feel more empowered and they feel more present and valued and dignified and respected, and they tend to see the whole process, they're more likely to see the whole process as fair. Well, if you've got all that going for you, then you've got a lot of building blocks for mental health right there. At least you've removed some of the obstacles to mental health. So I think, we do miss the wood for the trees with that. I think the fact that you don't, some organizations that sort of feel, well, we haven't got there yet, but are still involving people in the conversation, they actually are getting there more than they think. And that's the good news. We should celebrate that, because it's messy, and you don't necessarily have to say, here's the goalpost, but we're working toward it, and I think that's incredibly important. Whether it's in a formal labor management context or in a non-unionized environment, it's still the same principle, I think. So I think we don't take the whole idea of participation seriously enough in terms of its health promoting value.
No, but just like you've used the analogy with physical health and safety, we would never consider that physical health and safety should be a leader led and driven and that's it. We know that we have to involve the people there to think about what they need to be safe, to think about what the risks are from their perspective as well. And so it's very similar in that case.
It is. It is. And you know, at its best, I mean, the internal regulation system in occupational health and safety works for mental health for that very reason, that it is participative. I mean, that's one of the three real rights, is that, you know, the right to know, the right to avoid, to refuse unsafe work, and the right to participate. And that's the right to participate is the sort of the third string of that particular instrument.
So one of the things that we know is critical to mental health in the workplace is the relationship between frontline leaders and their employees. So we've talked about employees, you know, having awareness and understanding and carefulness. And we've talked about organizations assessing and acting on that assessment. But what would you have to say to frontline leaders about their impact?
Well, I think it's crucial. I said somewhere in one of the courses I've been working on recently for leading for psychological safety that your own conduct is the most powerful tool that you have for the construction of psychological safety in the workplace. But what does that mean? I mean, how can you examine your own conduct? And one way you can do that is to ask leaders to go through an exercise in which they examine the degree to which they are instrumental in influencing some of the key factors that we know influence mental health in the workplace, such as demand, control, effort, reward, fairness, supportiveness, and stuff like that. All of those are included in the national standard, but getting them to think about how their own behavior is conducive to reasonable, their workers having reasonable control over their work, making reasonable demands upon them, not requiring them to put out excessive effort to get the job done, mental or physical effort to get the job done. Making sure that they are rewarded and accredited appropriately for their efforts. I think probably more importantly than that is, to what extent are you as a leader trying to understand the legitimate needs, rights, and interests of the people that report to you, so that's the foundation of fairness. I mean, if you don't recognize somebody else's needs and rights, you're not likely to even try to accommodate them. So, to an examination of your own behavior through a self-assessment is now we know that there are various assessments for leaders out there having to do with some of those factors, and I think they can be that's a self-reflection thing. It's not something that they have to necessarily share with anybody else, but it's something that they can think about, you know, in terms of, well, how seriously do I take this? Am I aware of the effect that it's having on people? What would put myself in their shoes? What would they think about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it? And this is not a commonly undertaken exercise.
No, it's not, unfortunately. So, but you know, your neighbor at work, your three principles, right?
Yeah.
Work for the leaders to be self-aware.
Yeah.
So awareness, to have empathy and understanding for the impact that you're having on others and what they're going through, and being careful about it to.
That's a very important point, actually, because I think the neighbor at work identity is sort of like an invisible uniform that everybody puts on. And when they got it on, the CEO and the new recruit in the mailroom are on the same footing.
Right.
And they owe one another the same duty of care. But it obviously takes different forms depending on the kind of level of authority you have within the organization. But the fact of the matter is that this is a universal duty of care, and it's not something that's unique to any level or position within the organization. We're all on the same footing there.
Right. I may have rank, status, authority over you. I may be able to assign you work, but that doesn't mean that I don't have this duty of care to do no harm.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And if we can, I mean, sometimes I think people look at the neighbor at work stuff and they think, well, that's just the golden rule, isn't it? And it is, I mean, in a sense, but the thing about the neighbor at work imperatives, the three imperatives, it takes you down another level into, well, what do we have to do in order to be treated the way we'd like to be treated? What do we have to do in order to treat others the way we would like to be treated ourselves? I mean, it's part of it, but it's not, certainly not the whole of it. So,
but there's the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And then there's the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would have you do unto them.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah,
that just because I like you shooting straight from the hip and giving me it just full out, and I don't mind if somebody else is around, that doesn't mean that there's not someone else for whom criticism is a trigger and it's really difficult. You can't treat us the same, or treat us because you say, well, I'm fine with criticism, so what's the matter with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So believe it or not, we're coming up to the hour already.
Are we?
Yes, we are. So I want to give you a chance to share anything else that you think you need to record for posterity and to share with the listeners who are learning about psych health and safety, some of them for the first time, and some of them I know have been at it as long as I have. So what words of wisdom do you want to share with them?
Well, this is probably repeating something that we've already discussed, but I think I'd like to just underline it, and that is that, you know, we have now at this juncture in history an opportunity to bring the protection of mental health into the same framework as the protection of physical health, and to put it on an equal footing. Right now, it's not on an equal footing. It's half in and half out. We've got a wonderful voluntary standard that takes us to the brink, but it doesn't get us to jump over. Maybe that's the wrong image, but it's not getting us quite where we need to go. So I would put in a plea for us to, any actor within this field of endeavor, to seriously consider what would it take to help to get us to move into this next phase of historical development of occupational health and safety, because that's the way I see it. I see that as the context within which all this is happening. And, you know, we've gone 100 200 years really of occupational health and safety legislative development, in which we've gone from, you know, rudimentary factory acts through to the sort of regulations that we have now that apply to so many areas of the physical world, but we're still not there in terms of mental health. And that's what I would like to see, is serious consideration being given to how can we regulate this in a way that doesn't make it, I'm not looking to make it more burdensome for employers by any means. I'm just looking to get this on a level playing field.
Right, and to protect employees everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And so, Martin, this is the last question, and I'll just explain to you what I hope to do is do a collage of how people describe what a psychologically healthy and safe workplace looks like. And honestly, the first time I heard the phrase safe voice came from you. And so lots of people say psychologically healthy and safe workplace is one where you can speak up, where you have safe voice. But I want to hear from you how you would describe it to someone who really needs to get the feeling for what it's like to be in a psychologically healthy and safe workplace.
Right. Well, as a sort of preamble to that, I'd say safety first. So I put the safety part ahead of the health, because I think once you've created a psychologically safe workplace, you've got a level playing field for promoting health within that context. So to me, a psychologically safe workplace, or a psychologically safe system of work, if you prefer that term, is one in which every reasonable effort is made to prevent reasonably foreseeable harm to the mental health of workers. And that basically, that's it. I mean, it's got to do with the prevention of reasonably foreseeable harm. So all our efforts are built toward what do you have to do to be able to foresee harm. Well, so it takes us into the neighbor at work principles. You have to know enough about other people to know that you're not doing them harm, basically. So that's it, short and sweet for me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, for coming here, being live and in person.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Wonderful. And what will happen is this will be on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. It will be on the Psych Health and Safety Canada.com website, the podcast itself, and little bits of your brilliance will be cut out of this and put on LinkedIn for people to see, and that can lead them to, when they realize how brilliant you are, then they'll want to go listen to the entire podcast. Yeah. So thank you very much for being here and for everything that you've done to develop, promote psychological health and safety in Canada.
Well, thank you for having me, Marianne, and thank you for all your help over the years in getting me to this point.
Take care.